Reading today is the third chapter from the book of Ruth. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. But now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do it. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize her. For he said, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back, and then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." This is the end of the reading.
Thank you. And our reading picks up again at Ruth chapter 4 and goes to verse 17. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. Just then the Redeemer about whom Boaz had spoken was passing by. He said, "Sir, come over here and sit down." So he turned aside and sat down. And then he took 10 men from the town's elders and said, "Sit down here," and they sat down. Boaz said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has returned from the field of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belongs to our brother Elimelech. I thought that I should let you know and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you redeem it, redeem it. But if you won't redeem it, tell me so that I may know. There isn't anyone to redeem it except you, and I'm next in line after you." He replied, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "On the day when you buy the field from Naomi, you must also buy Ruth the Moabite, the wife of the dead man, in order to preserve the dead man's name for his inheritance." But the Redeemer replied, "Then I can't redeem it for myself without risking damage to my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself. You can have my right of redemption because I'm unable to act as Redeemer." In Israel, in former times, this was the practice regarding redemption and exchange to confirm any such matter. A man would take off his sandal and give it to the other person. This was a process of making a transaction binding in Israel. Then the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he took off his sandal. Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I've bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. And also Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, I bought to be my wife, to preserve the dead man's name for his inheritance, so that the name of the dead man might not be cut off from his brothers or from the gate of his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord grant that the woman who is coming into your household be like Rachel and like Leah, both of whom built up the house of Israel. May you be fertile in Ephrathah, and may you preserve a name in Bethlehem. And may your household be like the household of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the children that the Lord will give you from this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He was intimate with her. The Lord let her become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "May the Lord be blessed, who today hasn't left you without a redeemer. May his name be proclaimed in Israel. He will restore your life and sustain you in your old age. Your daughter-in-law, who loves you, has given birth to him. She's better for you than 7 sons." Naomi took the child and held him to her breast, and she became his guardian. The neighborhood women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They called his name Obed. He became Jesse's father and David's grandfather. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, I guess we'll just go on without that. Last week we started our 3rd annual summer sitcom sermon series, say that 5 times fast, and we started with Ruth, who we are finishing up this week, and next week we are turning our attention over to Deborah. Last week I asked the question that kind of begged to be asked: what is family and what does it mean to be family? And we learned 4 things that Ruth and Naomi teach us about family. 1, family isn't defined by biology, it is defined by love. 2, family doesn't quit just because things get hard. 3, family isn't worried about what it can profit or lose from one another. And 4, family doesn't exclude, it includes. There's going to be a test at the end of the series, so I hope you're writing this down. Today, I'm going to ask you another question, and unlike last week, I don't necessarily feel uniquely qualified to ask it, but it's something that bothers me. I think that's the right word. It bothers me, or at least I wonder about it. And I do think that the story of Ruth and Naomi also begs us to ask this question too. And the question is this: what is redemption? And what does redemption look like for you? What is redemption? And what does redemption look like for you? Now, Naomi and Ruth, they leave Moab and go back to the house of bread, or Bethlehem in Israel. And hopefully those of you who were here last week remember from last week that Moabite women were bad news for good Jewish boys, because good Jewish boys became bad Jewish boys and ended up dead around Moabite women. Read Numbers 25. So for Naomi to be coming back with Ruth, the Moabite, and all the men in her life are dead, well, it's not the most ideal way to go back home to Israel. But they go back, and Naomi sends Ruth to glean some of the harvest off of the fields belonging to a relative of hers, a guy by the name of Boaz. And Boaz sees this pretty young woman working really hard in his fields, and he says, "Whoa, Nellie, who is that?" I remember exactly the first time I saw my wife Beverly, I had the same reaction. I can even remember the exact outfit she was wearing that night. And when I leaned over to my friend Patrick and I asked him who she was, he said, "Her name's Beverly. She's an international business major at Gannett University and speaks 2 other languages, and she is way out of the league of some high school kid like you." And I said, "Oh yeah? Watch this." Boaz asks one of his helpers who Ruth is, and he's given the whole story about her. And while the story of Ruth and Beverly are different, Boaz and I had the same reaction, and he was taken by her. And he goes out of his way to help her out. And so Ruth goes back home to Naomi, and she tells her what had happened. And Naomi says, "This is good. This is what you're going to do. Boaz is going to be drinking tonight. So you're going to take a bath, You're going to put on some perfume. You're going to get all dolled up, and then you're going to go and you're just going to hang out. And after Boaz gets his drink on, and that's the Hebrew translation, after Boaz gets his drink on, you're going to go uncover and lay at his feet. And that's what Ruth does. She goes and waits for him to essentially pass out, and then uncovers his legs and lays at his feet. Now, if you're thinking that it's weird that Ruth would go and uncover some drunk guy's legs and then lay down at his feet, or wonder if this is some kind of weird biblical mating ritual, you're kind of right. That's weird. Don't try that, okay? It's so weird that I did some research on it, and what I read would make you blush, because let's just say that feet don't actually mean feet here. It's a euphemism for something located at the opposite end of the foot end of the leg, and that's as graphic as I'm going to get, because this is church. If you don't understand what I'm saying, talk to someone who is giggling or turning red what it means after the service, and they will explain it to you. So, Boaz and Ruth, they really like each other, and they want to be together. But the problem is, due to custom and tradition here, Boaz doesn't really get first claim to things here. See, back then they had this thing called a redeemer. Some translation call it a kinsman redeemer. And what this redeemer did was that if a relative was in trouble or in need, the redeemer would be the one who bailed them out or helped them. And there was a pecking order as to which relative was supposed to be the redeemer. And Boaz wasn't the first one in line. So he gathers together the elders and this first redeemer, and he says, Naomi's in trouble and she needs help. And he looks at the redeemer and he goes, you get first dibs on what she has, her land and everything that goes with it, like Ruth. So if you want it, it's totally yours. But, if you don't want any of that, I guess I'm next in line and I'll just take it off your hands. I'll take the land and, Ruth that I'm in love with off your hands, so you don't have to worry about any of that. And this guy's like, oh, yeah, I'm totally going to take it, which essentially means that Boaz's plan here is just blowing up in his face. So Boaz, in a moment of genius then, says, well, Ruth comes with this deal, and, she's a Moabite, and you know what they say about Moabite women and Israelite men, and, her husband's dead. And the guy's like, well, you can have her then. You can have it, without even a second thought. So Boaz quickly takes his role as redeemer then, and quickly takes Ruth as his wife, and then she turns around and becomes pregnant right after that, and everyone is ecstatic for Naomi and says Ruth is better than having 7 sons, which is a very biblical and very good thing to have back then. And Ruth gives birth to a son, and she names him Obed, and Obed grows up and has a son who he names Jesse. And Jesse grows up and he has a son named David, who becomes the king and redeemer of Israel, and so on and so on and so on until we get to the gospel according to Matthew chapter 1, with an ancestry that leads through Ruth and Obed and Jesse and David all the way down to a baby being born whose name is Jesus, who becomes our redeemer and the redeemer of the world. What is redemption, and what does redemption look like for you? This story of Ruth starts in famine and ends in a harvest. It starts with a woman losing her sons and ends with the birth of a son. It starts with a woman who wants to change her name to bitter because of all that she's lost, and ends up with her feeling and being blessed by all that she's gained. It's a strange story, to be sure, of 2 unlikely women banding together against all odds to become family and finding something more than they could have ever hoped for or imagined or even understood, especially what it would mean for us today. Because without this story, who knows if there would be our Redeemer Christ? It's a story of a family, and it's a story of redemption that leads to the big daddy of all redemption stories. And again, I think Ruth and Naomi and now Boaz have some important lessons to teach us about what redemption is and about what it can look like for us. So just like last week, then, let me leave you with 4 thoughts about how Ruth, Naomi, and now Boaz might answer this question of what redemption is and what it might look like for you. Number 1, redemption begins by getting drunk and waking up with a strange woman in your bed. Maybe not, but according to the Bible, that's a possibility. I mean, it's a way to read the story. All right, number 1, redemption begins in love. Redemption begins in love. It doesn't matter where you locate the beginning of redemption in the story, it begins in love. If you think the redemption begins with Ruth deciding to go with Naomi, that's an act of love. If you decide it begins when Boaz is literally the Redeemer, it begins in love because right from the beginning, it's pretty clear he's in love with her. The story of redemption begins in love. Christ's story of redemption begins in love. And I think it's safe to say that any story of our redemption begins in love too. Redemption, a lot like family, begins with love. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, now there is a final reason I think that Jesus says love your enemies. It is this, that love has within it a redemptive power. And there is a power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, he says they react in many ways in the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little bit more during the transition period. But just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see, said Dr. King. It is redemptive. And that is why Jesus says to love, there is something about love that builds up and is creative. Redemption begins with love. Number 2, redemption through God isn't limited to a specific people. It is open for everyone. This story would be a lot easier if Ruth wasn't a Moabite and she was an Israelite who were God's chosen people. That isn't as much of a challenge. But then the story wouldn't be nearly as extraordinary and wonderful either. And the story would also be too easy if it were just the outsider and stranger who gets redeemed, because then we could say that God clearly shows preferential treatment to the outcast and the stranger, but that isn't the case here. Both the outsider and the insider get redeemed, and crazy enough, they get redeemed by coming together. They get redeemed by coming together. Ruth's redemption is directly connected to Naomi, and Naomi's redemption is directly connected to Ruth. And that brings us to our third thing that Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz teach us about redemption. God's redemption usually comes to us through other people. If we look at the book of Ruth, God really only acts twice in the story. Once at the beginning to tell Naomi that the famine has ended in Bethlehem and that she should return. And then once again here at the end when it says God allows Ruth to become pregnant. Now there's a lot of God talk in between there, but there are only 2 times that God actually does something in this story. The rest of it is people talking about God's blessing and then trying to make that blessing happening for people. We are God's agents of redemption in the world. God acts through people. It's God becoming human in Jesus Christ that we find our redemption, and Christ tells us then to act on his behalf. If there's one consistent theme throughout the entire Bible, it's that God works through people. Now, we think they're extraordinary people, but really they're just average, often flawed, sometimes very flawed people just like us. And what ends up making them extraordinary is that they're open to and they act on God's will by becoming God's agent in the world. I'm willing to stick my neck out and say that God's love is best felt in this world through other people, and God's redemption is enacted in this world through people too. God acts in this world through people, and God's redemption usually comes through the love, care, and concern of people for one another who are acting on God's behalf, whether they realize it or not. God's redemption usually comes through the people that God puts in our life. And that leaves us then with our fourth and final and really important lesson on redemption from Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. Redemption doesn't mean that everything goes back to the way things once were. But it does mean that things get better. One of the things that has always bothered me about another redemption story that we find in the Old Testament, specifically the story of Job, is that at the end of the book of Job, Job gets everything back. His health comes back, he gets his lands, he gets his house, and it even says that Job gets new sons. That God gives Job sons to replace the ones that he lost. God gives him replacement children, and everyone acts like this is a one-to-one correlation, as if Job's grief or loss over his previous children should now be gone because he's got these new children, as if it's the same thing. And that annoys me because that's just not the way it works. The book of Ruth is a little bit more realistic. We don't get the sense here that Boaz is a replacement husband. He's something new. He's a promise of a new life. Things are different here. They aren't the same, and they don't go back to the way they once were, but something new happens here. And we don't know then that if life was better than it was before the story began, or if life was as good or equal to what it was before the story began, but life here is definitely better than where the story began. We've gone from famine to harvest, from death to birth, from bitterness to joy, from loss to gain. And at the end of the day, that's simply what God's redemption is. It is a healing. And it's a promise of that what may now feel empty will eventually somehow and in some way feel full again. It's not a promise that we're going to relive our best moments of life, or that things will go back to the way they once were, or that we won't still feel sometimes a sense of loss or of heartache. It's almost simply a promise that things can and will get better if we're open to the love and blessing that God is putting in our lives through other people. Sometimes things just break, whether it's through loss or struggle or heartache or just through life itself. And often when these things break, it's entirely out of our own control. And oftentimes it's nothing that we're responsible for. And there's nothing that we could have done to stop it or prevent it or protect ourselves from it happening or happening again. Sometimes things, they just break. Sometimes famines, whether those famines are physical or spiritual or emotional famines, they just happen. People we love and are close to, they die. Sometimes things just break. And sometimes they can be fixed, and sometimes they can't. But they never go back exactly to what they once were. But out of all the things that it can mean, what redemption ultimately means is that God doesn't leave us in that brokenness. That redemption means God doesn't leave us in this brokenness. It's the promise that this too shall pass. It may pass like a kidney stone, but this too shall pass. And if we're open to it, and if we accept it, God's redemption, which is open to everyone, can lead us back into something good, something whole, something maybe even better than where we once were when the story began. So, number one, redemption begins in love. 2, redemption is for everyone. 3, God's redemption usually comes through the people that God puts in our life. And number 4, redemption doesn't mean that things will go back to the way they once were. But it does mean that this too shall pass and things will get better. So let us pray. O Lord our God, as we sit in quietness, our thoughts are far from quiet sometimes. We're wrestling with doubts and fears. We're looking for answers. We're hoping against hope. We're seeking strength. We're hungry for warm sunshine, for healed bodies, for rest from tears. And God, your word says that the hungry will be filled, and so we ask today for you to fill us. Fill us with the breath of life. Fill us with thankful hearts. Fill us with calmness, courage, most of all with the knowledge of your presence and your redemption. There are others we know and love who are ill, and we ask, God, that you would surround them with your strong healing presence, that you would grant wisdom to those who need answers to difficult questions, that you would grant hope to those who despair and friendship to those who feel lonely. Most of all, Lord God, we pray that we may know your love, your great love that you have for each one of us. You know the hairs on our head. You count each beat of our heart. You knit us together when we were being formed. You know our getting up and our laying down. You are familiar with all our ways. There's not a place we can hide from you. You were there at our beginning. You'll be with us through to the end. And may we not lose sight of your constant care. We look to you, O God, to be present in our communities and in our world. Continue to show us how we at Westminster can be a part of your work in the world. Teach us how we can grow in faith and become more and more like Jesus. Show us how we can be agents of your redemption to people who need to be drawn closer to you. We ask, Lord, that you would bless the work of our hands. That you'd bless all that we offer today, not only what we give of our worship, but also of the offerings of our time and our talents. And now we gather all our prayers together, the spoken and the unspoken, and pray the prayer that you taught us, praying as one family, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Now let us offer our tithes and offerings to the Lord this morning.